Thank you for joining us for this evening's Author Talk. My name is Gina Duvernay, and I'm the Adult Services Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library. We are thrilled that you are all here, that our guests are here. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Karida Brown, author of The Battle for the Black Mind. And she's in red, if you can't tell. Dr. Karida L. Brown is a professor of sociology at Emory University, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on race and racism, sports and society, and historical archival methods. Dr. Brown is a Fulbright scholar, and her international research has been supported by national foundations such as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Hellman Fellows Fund. Brown currently serves on the board of the Obama Presidency Oral History Project. She lives in Atlanta with her husband, fine artist and illustrator, Charlie Palmer. Oh, I can hear myself now. And their two pugs, Pugsley and Blue. Moderating today's talk is Nicole Carr. Nicole Carr is an award-winning Atlanta-based investigative journalist and journalism professor at Morehouse College. The majority of most of her recent work for ProPublica has explored the intersection of race, politics, parental rights organizations, and democracy in public education. Carr has developed courses in history of the Black press, social justice, and investigative journalism for students and faculty at Morehouse and Spelman colleges, as well as Clark Atlanta and Howard universities. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Hey. Good evening. Okay, so this is good. So I am honored to share this stage, or to yield the stage to a fine intellectual who I also now call my friend, Dr. Karida Brown. And I don't think there could be a more timely book for us to be discussing right now. So kudos to you for the work that went into this labor of love, this necessary read that you have birthed. And I just want to kick us off with, and when we get to talking, we can talk. So we will be looking for the wrap, and we want to hear from you in the audience. But because this book is full of origin stories, okay, let's get the origin story, let's get the backstory on authoring this book, what led you to this research, and we'll take it from there. I have a million questions, but let's just start with the origin story for the book.
So first of all, hey, y'all. It is so good to be back home in Atlanta. I've been on a book tour. So I'm here, there, and everywhere. Just came back from Baltimore last night. But there's nothing like being home with my folks to share the work. So I appreciate you all coming out. Thank you so much, Nicole. Nicole is my friend in real life. And Gina, may I add just a little something to that bio? Because it's something when you walk into your friend's home and you say, are those Emmys? Not one, not two, not three, but four of them just casually sitting above the fireplace. So it is an honor to share a stage with you. Thank you so much. So we're talking about origin stories. The battle for the Black mind has been in the making for 8 years. That's how long the archival research took for this book. But really, it's been a story of intergenerational educational freedom dreams. This book is very personal for me. Why? Because my parents, Richard and Arnita Brown, who live here in Atlanta, in Decatur, grew up in Jim Crow. They grew up in a little coal mining town called Lynch, Kentucky, a border state, but a Jim Crow state nonetheless. And what that meant for my parents is that they went to what were called colored schools. These are schools that were legally separate and unequal and designed by the state to be inferior, okay? Now, that's not necessarily what they got inside, because their good Black teachers made sure that they got otherwise. However, the institutional field was set up that way for not only my parents, but all Black kids throughout the South. That was the context for nearly a century in these United States. So as I've taken my educational journey, I've been in school for over half my life, y'all. 2 masters, a PhD, Ivy League degrees. I'm a professor at Emory University. And these are not just brags. It's the context, because I think a lot about my parents. I teach at a school that my parents couldn't even apply to in their youth. So how is that in just one generation when you remove those structural barriers? And as you like to say, Dr. Carr, education is the great equalizer. So I'm a testament of that in my own family. So in this book, I wanted to honor and amplify that history of Black education in the United States, this 100-year history in our country. And I wanted to not only center how power works, because I hope we get to talk about that today. Yes. We're going to talk about systems of oppression, but the book really centers on the resilience and the tactics. Hey, Mom. Hey, Dad. I was just talking about y'all. Richard and Arnita Brown. That's right. But the book centers on the resilience of a people, our educational journey through the stories of various Black educators, in hopes to tell the varied and diverse stories of how education has always been something that Black Americans have valued and something that's always been a part of our freedom dreams.
Sure. And hey, Mom, hey, Dad, you just missed the part where there was, an ode to you, recognition of,
You like that?
Yes, of how you value education. Yes, everybody has their copies. Glad to see you here.
We have recognition when you go on the dog spank on behind that. Right?
We said, okay, good. we can just make this interactive the whole time. We don't have to have the conversation between us before Q&A. No, but so you talk about the great equalizer. We've had these discussions, and also talking about education as, and this is what I say when I'm reporting, I'm like, it's a democracy beat, right? It's more than test scores and assessments and talking about what schools are being built and where funds are going. It is the one system, public education, it's the one system most of us will flow through in our lifetime, right? So it's where we're shaped. One part of the book, and we've had these discussions before, I'm gonna get straight to some of the tea here. You really dig into philanthropy in the book. And so the way that we tell this story is important, like who had a stake in education, who believed in it, but also why did they believe in education for the colored child, for the Negro. You tell you tell an honest story, that this wasn't always just goodwill when it comes to philanthropy, but this was about putting people in certain places. Can you talk more about that? And then you highlight the philanthropists that you want to talk about here.
Okay. So that's why I was intentional about the title of the book, The Battle for the Black Mind, because what I learned through the archives is that everybody had a stake in Black education, in the Black mind. There's a reason why during slavery, Black people were forbidden to learn to read and write. Why? Because we know knowledge is power. And who knows that better than your oppressor, right? So in freedom, after the Civil War, after emancipation, the question was not only what kind of education should Black folks get, but if they should have it at all. Everybody had a stake in that question, okay? So that sets up this battlefield. And what I found was, from white Southerners, right? They had an interest in the Black mind, but also white philanthropists from the North. missionaries from the North, religious institutions, and of course, nobody had a greater stake in Black education than the newly freed African Americans in this country. So I tell this varied story. From the philanthropy side, it was really important for me to dig into this because that's the history that stays in the background. This is about how power moves, how the powerful have always played the long game in setting up these systems and institutions. So I want you to think about today, because this book is not just a history, it's a playbook. Okay, and there's a lot that rhymes with what's going on today. So what if I told you that we have seen this before, where the state abandons the public education system? Back in the day, just for Black folks, all right? That was called Jim Crow. That was when the state refused to put equal dollars into funding Black public schools. And then also billionaires swept in to privatize the Black education system. They did this through philanthropic organizations. These are your Carnegie corporations, your Rockefeller corporations, and smaller mid-sized philanthropies. All were swooping into the South, trying to not only set up a school, but take over the whole damn system. Okay, and build a curricula that served their interest. So I tell that story because it shows how power plays the long game, how there's room for everybody to play a role, Black and white, okay? And to show the parallels, because we're seeing that today. What does today's long game plan look like? Ever heard of Project 2025? That is a coalition of power brokers who have landed on a set of concerted interest, and they're moving a long-term agenda forward. This has been in play for decades. Well, we've seen this before when they were putting this in place with the Southern Strategy for Black Education. So I make sure to tell the story of the origin story of these big philanthropies, meddling in Black folks' business. I also I name them. And I named the players, but also demonstrate that there were also, you ever heard the phrase, all skin folk ain't kin folk?
Right.
You had a lot of Black folk also participating and benefiting from the goodies that come from the proximity to power, whiteness, and wealth. So all of that bears itself in the book.
I want to go back to something you were saying about education and knowledge being power, and codifying or keeping folks from being able to learn by using the law. We know here in Georgia, we had a 1788 law that forbade you from teaching the enslaved to read and write. But then it was expanded upon closer to the Civil War, and it said you can't teach a freed person of color or an enslaved person, because they thought you might get a hold of abolitionist material and start spreading the word.
That's right.
When you are making these discoveries and you're going through the archives, can you talk a little bit about the methodology? Because whenever we get together and we start like comparing notes, things we're researching, it's like we're getting at the same things, but we find them in a million different places. And so there's a strategy to finding the storylines, the very unique ones that you've detailed throughout the book. Where were you finding these gems? Because there's a lot that's will be new to us. You know, even when you think you know something, it's like, well, I had no idea, you know, that detail. Where were you starting with this? And like, how were the dots connecting between the different archives, the different collections, and how much of it was here in Georgia?
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's a lot. I know, that's like 3 questions.
So it was frustrating at first, because remember I said, okay, so this has been an 8-year journey.
Right.
The first 4 or 5 years were me chasing the story of power.
Okay.
So in the search for trying to reconstruct the Black education system in the South, You spend most of your time in the archives in the North,
Right.
in Manhattan, in Connecticut. That's where the philanthropies offices are, because that's where the industrialist headquarters were. Okay, so it was a follow the money type game. But what became interesting, Nicole, is I was searching for power so I could, just lay out the skeleton of the system. But once you do that, that's when the ancestors start to speak to you, because you're looking at a system, okay, separate, unequal, intentionally inferior. But I know that our people didn't stand for that. So what were they doing in spite of these systems, and how were they navigating them? I'll share a story about, because you mentioned this law that prohibited Black people free or enslaved in Georgia from learning. I opened the book with the story of a woman named Mary Smith Peak. By show of hands, who has heard of Mary Smith Peak? Great. And this is what you'll get in the book. You'll learn about so many hidden figures, especially Black women who have just blazed trails and made the impossible happen. So Mary Smith Peak, she's born in 1823 in Virginia during slavery, but she's born free. Her parents circumvent the law on the book in Virginia by sending her to DC to get an education. So Mary goes to high school. When she graduates, she could have stayed in DC or stayed north, but no, she comes back to Virginia. She opens up a dress shop during the day. That's her pretend gig, right? That's the front.
That's the front. Yeah.
What is she doing in the evenings? She is sneaking onto plantations, teaching enslaved Black people to read, write, and what she calls cipher. Okay? And she does this for over 20 years. Now, I want to remind you, when we say against the law, the penalty, if she was caught doing that, would be a sure and quick death. Okay, so she risked her life understanding that knowledge is power, but that also demonstrated that she was activating a political imagination called freedom dreaming. She saw a day where her people would be free, and she knew that this education, that this knowledge would be essential for Black people to be able to navigate in freedom. So she believed that. And the only thing that brought her out in the open, y'all, was the Civil War. The Civil War, Hampton, where she lived, got burned down to the ground. She, like many other Black folks, run to the Union Army base, where they wait in the precipice of freedom until the Civil War is over. And she starts her school out in the open under an oak tree. And she teaches there. She doesn't live to see the end of the war, so she doesn't know the result. But she stands on faith, teaches dozens of what they call contraband, at the time, contraband of war, Black folks, how to read and write. She passes away, but that oak tree still stands today, 300 years old. It is called Emancipation Oak. It is the first place in the South where the Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud. Hampton University sits on that tree, on that oak tree. So I want you to understand that that HBCU is founded on Mary Smith Peak's freedom dreams.
Oh, I just I know that story. I was waiting with you. It was like everybody's eyes were like, wait, when the tree is where and it's standing and what happened and it's like, woo, and you feel this. I felt that through my body. What are some other, can you give us a couple of examples where you kind of had to push yourself back from the research table, where you found, because some of this stuff, a lot of it you're familiar with. You're like, I know where this story is going, but the beauty of the research is the discovery and the dig and connecting the dots. So what were a couple of times that just gave you a feeling like I think a lot of us just had in hearing about Mary Peak, right? Where you were sitting at the table and you're like, whoa, okay, I was brought here. I was supposed to find this. I was led here. What were two aha moments you remember while researching?
One that I just couldn't stand, but it needed to happen. It was the story of a young woman, a teenager named Barbara Johns. So, and she comes in at the very end of the book where I'm talking about how small acts fall big tree. That's a Jamaican folk saying, and it means it's 1,001 little things that we do on a daily basis that makes change, and that's how we do democracy, because that's a verb, right? Well, Barbara Johns was a 14 or 15-year-old girl going to school in Farmville, Virginia, Robert Musa Moton High School. And her school, like many others, were separate, unequal, and meant to be inferior. This school was dilapidating structurally, and the Black parents of the community kept petitioning the all-white school board in their community to no avail. So Barbara Johns, she waited until her teachers left the room, went behind her parents' back, gathered the rest of her classmates, not the ones that they not like us, but the ones that, that were cool, right? And she said, we got to turn this upside down. We can't wait no more, and she said, it's going to be the youth that are going to get this done, okay? Right. So she organizes a student-led protest. And again, these are 14, 15, 16-year-olds during Jim Crow, okay? And they launch a walkout. And they walk downtown to City Hall and demand a better school. They petition, but then they also reach out to the NAACP and ask if they will represent them and take on their case. And they sue their Board of Education alongside the NAACP. Yes. This is actually the very first case in the long line of cases that leads to Brown versus Board of Education. Those cases started in the 30s that led to, okay? And this is a teenager enacting her freedom dream. So we see examples from during slavery all the way up to when I end the book, during Brown versus Board of Education, over and over and over again, Black people not waiting for permission, and taking their education into their own hands, not just to get the credential. The credential does matter, okay? The reading, writing, and arithmetic, you got to get that. But education was so much more. And they understood that. They fought for that. The annoying thing that I'm not going to harp on, there was this man, W.E.B. Du Bois, coined him the evil genius of the Negro race. A man named Thomas Jesse Jones. And he was this behind the scenes, busybody, he wasn't quite powerful in his own right. So he always had to buddy up to power. He was two-faced, like a mug. And And Thomas Jesse Jones, he was a white man, but he was Welsh, and that mattered a lot because he had this accent that bothered him his whole life. He would talk about how he couldn't fully assimilate into being white in America because his skin was a little too, what he would say, swarthy, and his accent gave him away, right? So he was up to things. But he said, okay, if I can't be a powerful white man in the white world, I'm going to run all things Negro. I am going to be the expert on Negro education, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And he achieved that. He achieved that through these philanthropies. And what really surprised me was how hard it was to find him, because unlike any other person of his stature, he doesn't have an archive of his own. At the time I was studying him, he didn't even have a Wikipedia page. I searched for him for 2 years before I found a document, but I had to tell that story of the sneakiness of power, because that was going to help illuminate, what was going on.
Oh my.
And we could have a whole different session on Du Bois alone. But we're not going to go there because that's like a whole deal in and of itself. You just talked about Farmville. I want to add that those kids and their activism paved the way for my mother's older siblings to go and teach in the integrated schools. They still live in Farmville. Yeah, I never told you that, but my aunt has a lot of, and now she's inching toward, she's in her early 80s now, but they came in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of that, in the structural changes in Farmville, because they shut the schools down in Farmville rather than adhere to Brown v. Board once we got there. You talk about, well, I don't know if I want to do this early, but you just said it. You end the book at Brown v. Board. When we met in the archives at Spelman College.
Yes.
She was there. You had just given a talk nearby, and you were with your dad. Yep. I met you. Do you remember being in the spot? You probably, I don't think we were paying attention to each other. I think you were ready to go.
You were getting that bicycle.
Yeah. The bicycle. You were but I remember you. And we were in the archivist's office. You were asking for someone, and I was coming out and was like, well, what do you do? What do you do? And I had spent 3 years investigating the parental rights movement and the cross-section of extremism and the framing of the concerned parent as one of the concerned parent being the white mother, the mama bear, the whatever, and us not framing parental concerns around Black folks. Of course, your book chronicles and debunks that framing. One, with everything you've already said, that we're very vested in education historically, understand the power, wanted it, thirst for it, fought for it, would put our lives on the line for it. There's no more concerned parent you could have than the Black parent when it comes to this. As you're finishing this, and we get to this landmark decision, but all of the chaos around us is happening, because that's how we connect it. You're like, you understand what I'm saying? You're studying it in real time. I'm doing this archival research. Was there a point when you just, and maybe the book was already off to the publisher, I don't know, like they said, you have to end this now. Did you want to loop back around and draw these parallels? You talk about young people in protest. You talk about banning things. You talk about the laws that forbid us from doing this. We talk about history and being able to find the archive. If you'd had the option to keep going, where would you have ended the book and why? Or would it ever end? Would you have finished?
I think the book says everything that it's supposed to say for such a time as this. And it's funny, the book was due to the publisher on November 13th, okay, of 2024, right after Election Day. So I waited until the election results to write the last 2 chapters of the book, because that was going to determine whether this was going to be and now, here goes this new chapter where we have this president who is a HBCU alumna, and this is, rainbows, right? Or it was going to be a different reality, and those chapters were going to look very different. And I sat in one sitting and finished that book the day I mourned on Election Day and said no more. After that, I went through a phase of radical acceptance. Why? Because I'm an educator, and I know that in times like this, I have to be a guidepost for my students. I have to sit in my power. There is no time for me to sit in despair if I'm going to do what the Black educators what I know my elders and ancestors would have done in this moment. So I wiped my tears, and I wrote those last 2 chapters of the book in that despair. And I wrapped it up in the book with yes, it ends at Brown versus Board of Education, but I end the book with an epilogue of 10 things that we all can be doing right now.
That was my next question. What's your charge to your?
I didn't want to just leave it at, and this happened in history. You know, here are some examples of what happened in the past, because we have a lot to do now, y'all. Anybody who's invested in the future of education in this country, you know, we've got to roll up our sleeves. So I left 10 action steps that we all could tap into and be taking from your own seat. Actions that we can take even if you're not rich. I know all of y'all are rich. Even if you ain't got no LLC. Even if you don't have all the credentials after your name, I know that we are the change. I know that even if the cavalry is not coming, we can look to the left and the right in this room and see the change that we want to see. Okay, so I left some steps for us to think about and add to, so that it's not a book that just stays in the past, but how can we draw lessons from our history, because I keep referring to our ancestors because they are ours, y'all, and they left us a blueprint. They left us a playbook, and sometimes we just need to be reminded of that through these stories,
Right.
so we can. If you think about a relay, right? They pass the baton, the relay must be assured. It's our turn. Yeah.
I want your kind of overarching thoughts to this theme of what we pull from history. I think when we're in real time, right, it's very easy to normalize things that are not normal. One, out of probably survival mode. You're like, life goes on, I'm still here, so I gotta get on with the next thing. But what history allows you to do is see those patterns, draw those parallels. What do you think, how do you think people may, or readers may, reframe the moment after reading this? Because it's very easy to say, well, this is not my business, or I don't have kids, or I've got to do these things. Like, why should I be on the front lines of anything? It's time for me to rest. You know, all the things that we feel. Once they read through these narratives, how do you think you reframe this very moment?
Oh, I love this question. History has taught me that the moral conscience of a nation is and has always been the school. If you want to know what a country is doing to astral project itself into the future, what it's up to, what the battles are, look at what's going on in the education system and what the leaders are beefing about.
Right.
Okay. And that's because, as you say, education is democracy. So it goes well beyond whether you have children in the school system or children at all, whether or not, you're interfacing with education. It's a spillover context. It's not a surprise that Brown versus Board of Education was about whether or not to desegregate public education in America. Why? Because if public education was desegregated, you better believe every other facet of public life would follow suit. It's democracy. So we all have a vested interest in this. And if I can, Nicole, I'll give you a playbook that became very, very apparent to me in this book that I realized we're seeing it play out again today. It's the same playbook. They didn't even add nothing to it. It's tired, and there are 3 steps. Number 1, defund. That is, defund your public infrastructure. Not so it's erased, but just so it's on its shaky ground, so nothing quite works right. So right now we are in the process of watching that happen to our Department of Education.
Sure.
Okay. And not only the DOE, but our entire knowledge infrastructure, our library systems, our museum systems, our databases that allow us to study how inequality works in our country. If those infrastructures are weak, okay, what does it do? It gets you to step 2. It's manufactured chaos. Nothing's working right. I'm scared.
Right.
I need stability. My kids need XYZ. Okay, things need to work. And that manufactured chaos just generates fear. It generates a sense of being overwhelmed, a sense of despair. And the hope is that folks will just throw their hands up and say, there's nothing I can do. I'm just one person. Step 3, in that despair, folks start to look for a savior. That's when the billionaires sweep in. That's the 3rd step, y'all. The billionaires sweep in and say, I have the solution to your problem. Let's privatize everything. Let's privatize those public goods. And I want to ask you, Nicole, how did that work when we did that with retirement plans? When we switched from pensions to 401ks, saying, let's privatize that. You need more choice.
Right.
Okay, now you can win big, but if you don't, whose fault is that? Who's abdicated all responsibility? Okay, how does that work with your health care? Should our public goods be privatized en masse? That's the question. That's what's on the table today with our education system, with this playbook. That's what was on the table then. The only difference is back then during Jim Crow, it was good enough for Black folks, so the rest of America sat perhaps with apathy or with benign, misgivings, okay? Today, that treatment is available to everybody. And what many Americans are experiencing or realizing is that we all can have a Black experience in this country, okay? So keep that playbook in mind. Don't fall for that step 2 with that manufactured chaos. Remember that it is power to the people, not power to the people in power. You like that? Yeah. All right.
Look, okay, I have bars. Okay. So I just feel like I should not say anything after that. We should open it up for questions. And I see heads nodding. I see the curiosity. Do we have, are folks stepping up, or we're going to project? Okay. And I'll repeat if we can't hear. Yeah.
Hi, how you doing? I remember when you started this book, right? This was almost 5 years ago. I like to term that as pandemic years ago, when you started writing this book. And I walked in late, so I missed a bit of the conversation. So I'll start where you ended. And you talked about this being a playbook, but can you talk about some of the tips that, common folk can use in their everyday lives to disrupt what's going on now? Because your book is quite timely, even though you started 5 years ago, where we are today with education and just public chaos. What are some of the tools that common folk can do outside of voting? Because we always hear, get out and vote, get out and vote. But what can we do outside of voting?
I want to acknowledge in our audience Ida Harris, who is on the executive team for Black Enterprise Magazine. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'll talk about 2 steps. One is a repeat, but they go hand in hand. So that small axe fall big tree, I saw that over and over and over again, expressed by the women who are the protagonists of the book. So when I saw Mary McLeod Bethune move from South Carolina to Daytona Beach, Florida, seeking out a community that had a lot of Black folks with no school. And she takes the $2 in her pocket and starts knocking on doors for the community members and saying, I'm starting a school. What can you do? And the community members respond in kind and say, well, I know how to sew, or I got some old furniture. I can build a building, and suddenly the community builds up that school. She starts the Daytona Industrial School for Negro girls. By year 2, it's a co-ed institution. Years in, it's a K through 12 institution. Decades in, she builds the first Black nursing school in the state of Florida. Why? Because our people couldn't even take our kids to the hospital if they needed care. They would get turned away. So she builds this educational enterprise. That school still stands today as Bethune-Cookman College. But it starts out not with her saying, I got to get a PhD, then I got to raise $1 million, and then I need the land and this and that. She starts with what she has, the $2 and a vision. So small acts. What are your small acts? What are your freedom dreams? What resources do you have? What are your skills? What are your hopes for your community? And sometimes it's just about showing up. The fact that we're here right now in a third space, cultivating intellectual community is a part of that. So small acts is about playing the short game, because we gotta live, y'all. But step 2 is also play the long game. And I demonstrate that through how Power did it, but I also very clearly lay out how African Americans have played the long game too through these educational journeys. So we've got to do both and. We've got to get to where we're going with the everyday, with the $2 in your pocket, okay? But where are we going? What do you imagine and want this America to look like for you and your family and the children that are to come from your lineage once this dust settles? Because this regime is not going to last very long. It's crumbling right now. On my way here, I was watching the little Twitter fight. Like, it's already breaking down. And so we must dream for the long game and start putting those, plans into place and getting serious about that in a material way. Not just hopes are about you want something to happen. Vision is then applying an action plan to that. And sometimes that means coming together with folks that you may not fully agree with on every single issue, but finding areas of commonality, being able to build trust. That's a process. It comes before actually being able to act together in coalition. So that long game process takes a lot of our humanity, a lot of vulnerability, a lot of resource, sometimes a lot of setbacks and sometimes failure to get there. But we did it. We did it through founding organizations, building institutions. One example are our Divine Nine. Okay, these are historically Black fraternities and sororities that are born out of the necessity and the understanding that each of us needs all of us through these educational institutions. So, and look at what they've done. Look at the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. This is one of the very first nationally federated organizations in the US, where Black women's organizations at the local and regional levels got together and said, okay, let's create an umbrella institution that will advance Black women's interest on a national level to push for things like Black women's voting rights, because they were left out of this. Okay, so that's playing the long game. So both and. Right. Small acts, get your little $2, but also play that long game. And even when we get into a room and we might get our feelings hurt, or it might not go the way that we had hoped, we don't have time to be canceling one another. We have to find a way to work together, because there's a small group of folks who are right now thinking that they run things in this country that are depending on us not being able to come together, depending on us staying divided.
Well, and just adding to that really quickly, you're talking about centering humanity in this. I mean, one thing about the suffrage march, right? Because I just thought about Ida B. Wells at this. She pushes herself to the front of that suffrage march. When we were relegated to the back, but we understood white women needed the right to vote before we would get it. So we supported it and supported the right thing to do, even when we were disrespected. But it's the humanity in it all that allows people to move forward. And also the idea that one thing folks who, as you said, think they're running the country for everybody, but not for all, understand is that all politics are local politics. Mm-hmm. That the ballot box is still key. That's why access to it is cut off so often. So when you're building, a lot of people turned around when I was running these investigations. They said, I didn't know the school board representative. I didn't know all this was happening. They know. And they know what that body can do to enact small changes that amount to large changes, that amount to that chaos that you're talking about. So it's kind of paying attention, and it's exhausting, yeah? It's paying attention to everything, but kind of centering that humanity and knowing that it all matters. So do we have another question in that? I feel like, oh, okay, right.
So there's a couple of things you said that stuck out to me. One, education is democracy, and two, power is a long game. When I think about that, I might have been in second grade when George W. Bush was elected, and thinking of No Child Left Behind. I find myself often saying when I read something on social media, George's child has been left behind. And so with that, thinking about how that has played out over a long time, it's been about 20, 23 years. And thinking about how that played out in politics and the fact of like even the messaging from the other side and other parties, there's like this low taxes, this like very, very small, like thinking about that, like how do you strategize to like undo so much of that where people can easily fall from like misinformation? And then what is your freedom dream like when you think about that?
Oh, wow. I love that question because this is something that Nicole and I talk about all the time. One of the most fundamental things that we all can be doing as a continuing education praxis is getting up our media literacy. That is not something that we are taught for the most part in school, K through 12 or college. Acquiring that media literacy to even understand how these arguments are framed, but how political rhetoric is introduced into the public sphere, these sound bites that we pick up and talking points. I'll give you one that's, repeated today. I remember I grew up during the No Child Left Behind birth as well. And the rhetoric today that you might hear is around school choice. Don't you want choices? It sounds great, right? It's very seductive. Also, states' rights. I want rights. I don't want nobody telling me what to do. So these framings, rhetorical framings that are propagated through the media, we really should put an onus on ourselves to have a critical lens for not only what these phrases really mean on the ground, but also being able to ask ourselves, who benefits from that? Whose message and script is this? When it comes to states' rights, because that's a big push right now under Project 2025 in the education chapter. It's the idea to completely dismantle the Department of Education is couched under states' rights and parental choice. When you hear states' rights, I want you to ask yourself, states' rights to do what and to who? Because the last time that a states' rights campaign won, what did we get? Jim Crow, immediately. Okay, so that rhetoric meant something, and it means something today. Parental choice, that sounds seductive. But that language is steeped in a movement, and Nicole has been investigating this for years now. But it's steeped in a movement to fully privatize education. to the extent where it will create a system of haves and have-nots, meaning that, and I'll frame this as a question, are you okay with the idea that only children and communities that are deemed deserving get quality education, get the education dollars? Because that is a justification for how states will have the rights to allocate some dollars to some communities disproportionately and other dollars not, because maybe you're not showing up in a way that looks deserving. So this rhetoric, it's important for us to have an analysis for.
We'll add to that now with a modern day example. I don't know if you all have read headlines out of Cobb County, but the superintendent is now very concerned with the building permits for multi-unit housing, in other words, apartments, and saying this is going to stress our school system, our resources, but really what does that mean? Because we all have to live somewhere, right? So does it mean that yes, and what is the demographic of children living in, right? And as a journalist, and when I'm doing this in training and stuff, I'm like, hey, y'all, it's one thing to repeat what's in the press release or go and cover the thing, but what does that mean? So we have data on that. We know who needs the housing. We know the demographics of the people who live in there. Right. We also know that cutting that out kind of gives the dollars to the best school system, one of the best in the state of Georgia. Now we're relegating this to two-parent suburban homes. We're saying that you're deserving of this, but do I pay taxes if I live in the apartment? Are my children any less, right? And so,
I just wanted to jump in really quick. With a question. In situations like that, where the state or the governor has their way, is that where children being bussed out of their communities develop?
I mean, M2M didn't even work here. When we did, minority to majority or majority to minority, like they were still fighting that in the early 90s. Like, y'all, we were watching A Different World in the Cosby Show, right? And still had segregated schools in DeKalb County in the 90s that weren't adhering to federal law that comes out of Brown. Like where her book ends, it didn't end. Right. Like we were still living through this. So yes, sir.
To be helpful, if you're researching school choice, particularly in the Deep South, 40 years ago, particularly Southern white parents wanted to send their child to the neighboring school district, and they wanted the taxes that they paid to fall into that child.
Oh my God. Yeah, right. School choice. Right. Yeah. And then we have the data now for our short-lived school, for the vouchers, because we're talking about choice, but vouchers, but we already see where this is maintaining or recreating segregationist academy culture. Like, it's not a political thing or my side or whatever. We have the data for it. And so I do think, and it's not my talk, but I'm just getting on my media high horse here. Like, it's one thing to repeat the thing, That's why reporters don't know what the hell they're talking about with DEI. You don't know what it is because you've allowed the catch-all phrase. So it means any and everything, so it creates the chaos that we're talking about. Because we don't even have a definition. Yes, sir.
No, just to add, or tagging what you just said, it's essential to have more intergenerational conversation because we fight the same fight.
Yes. And that's what, yes.
And so we're not feeling like we have to start over from scratch when this has been this battle has been ongoing. So why pick up like we're, brand new each and every time? There is wisdom to pass down. There are strategies, but there are also lots of grassroots work that is ongoing, and it behooves us all to also get to know what organizations are, in these knee deep in these battles in your own community and plug in. Sometimes it's necessary to start something new, but oftentimes there's already an existing framework. And, you know, in another life, I worked for the Los Angeles Lakers. So I used to work for a sports franchise. And I learned during my time then, and I worked on the business side, whenever we were looking to move in an area to do like, to drive social change, and to say, okay, let's make the stadium a polling place, right? Let's get around this idea and partner with, you know, local grassroots organizations who are already working on voting access. Right. You would have players say, well, I want to start a nonprofit around the same issue. And this idea that we always need to be the one to start something new, to be the headliner and the frontliner, sometimes that's necessary if there is no existing vehicle. But I notice in our community, that's often, we create a competing institutional field where now we're competing for the same resources, the same, oh, y'all understand? Okay, yes. So that again is going back to what I'm encouraging about cultivating community and solidarity amongst one another and building trust. We've got to trust one another. You know, and that doesn't come just overnight, it's earned, you know, but that's one of the ways that we're going to be able to build power intergenerationally and at the local level. I saw her too, her and then her.
There was someone else?
No.
Okay. I can't wait to get my hands on your book. And I'm currently reading a book called Ratchetdemic by Christopher Edmond. And he talks about how he says that the current educational system that we have now, the public education system, has partially educated children of color. And he goes into a lot of things like that. And then I'm thinking about, like, during COVID, the largest number of homeschooling communities were parents of color. And so I'm conflicted in what you're saying because I'm hearing grassroots, that's homeschooling. Mary McLeod with food, that's homeschooling. But then at the same time, we talk about competing for resources. So I just wanted to know what your take is on homeschooling.
Okay, so this is going to be my personal take, and Nicole, I'd like to hear where you're at with this as well. I'm a advocate for homeschooling, especially for Black and brown kids in such a time as this, because there are times when the state demonstrates that our children are not safe in their hands. And I think that having measures and other modes of educational infrastructures is really important for us to have as a part of a suite of options for our kids. And when I say homeschooling, what I think about are some that are just individual units within a family, okay? But also a pod structure. We saw a lot of that during COVID, where, you know, 6 or 7 or 8 families got together and created a school pod. So there are multiple ways to do that. When I think about homeschooling, I also think about a hybrid model where your kids might be in public school or their charter school, but we need freedom schools too. Weekend schools or after school programs that are for us, by us, and about us, that are not a part of the school system proper, where we can be supplementing our children's education, especially in, again, a time where the state has demonstrated to us loudly that they have not earned our trust. So I'm a personal advocate for versions of homeschooling, but also I ain't got no kids. So remember that, okay? Nicole does. What do you think?
I got a lot of kids. I have 3 kids and had come through the pandemic 4 months postpartum when we shut down and running live television out of the house. So had a middle child in kindergarten who did not end up with a full year of in-person school until the 3rd grade. And I had one on the verge of, who I saw go into puberty, like before my eyes. I'm like, she shut down and she was a child. She came out. And then a newborn. And for us, so we kept them out of school, and it didn't want to, went to an open house when it was time to open back up, and then the Delta variant was raging. And we happened to be in a district that said you can't ask about a mask, you can't talk about it, like they were not taking measures. And so I was like, I can't afford, they can't be sick. So the homeschooling thing came out of a survival mechanism, not because it was something planning to, go into this, but it was survival. That suite of options is something I think we've always lived by, COVID or not COVID. So we don't go to church in the same place where we go to school. We don't go, so you've got different demographics when you go to school. You learn a different way when we go to church. I grew up military, 10 schools, moved 10 times before I was 15. So there's not a person on the planet Earth I can't talk to, that I can't. And so I wanted that for my kids too, even if we weren't hopping up and leaving. So I want you to get this cultural experience here, get this learning, be rooted in our traditions here, learn another language here, appreciate and respect other people. Because really school is just socialization, right? We're lifelong learners. And so we always, I think, need to think about the suite of options. So, but what you're not going to do is exclude me from having the option to stick this thing in my suite of options. And I think that's the fight that is like never ending. You don't get to exclude me. I get to pick. That is choice. That is true choice. That is the right? I get to pick, but my child should have an expectation of quality wherever that thing lands. Yes. And systemically, that's not going to happen in some places. In other places, it doesn't. But I don't know. I don't even know if we're getting it right, but we're trying, and it includes all of that. So, yeah, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all to that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me give you. Mm-hmm. Sorry. No, that was my like, we brought you here to moderate, not to.
So I am one of those school founders that you talk about who have, we call them micro schools, one-room schoolhouses. There's a collective of us called Black Micro Schools ATL with about 25 micro schools in the metro Atlanta area. And to my sister's point back here, we serve kids and families who need another option at the time, right? And provide that personalized learning. And then there's the struggle of being schools that accept school choice funding, ESAs, vouchers. But if we don't, then these kids who need an actual just another option would not be able to afford the Mary McLeod Bethune experience, right? And so, just can you speak on that particular conflict? Like, we as Black founders, primarily female, we don't want to be seen as the other Negroes taking the money, okay? But at the same time, we want to make sure that we are good stewards of what's already put out there of those resources, right? Because we're certified teachers, we've taken our retirement money, we've taken our $2, right? Mm-hmm. To set up these spaces for kids and families. But at the same time, we have to be able to serve them in the long run, right?
I'm sorry, but statistically, you're still not getting the money. I think from the voucher money, like I was just watching this ABC Nightline story that featured someone who really reminds me of you and everything you just said. And they were going to the state capitol to petition school choice, but the money, the dollars distributed so far have not been distributed equally. Do you find?
Well, it hasn't started yet. So it doesn't start until next school year for Georgia.
Okay,
Yeah,
for what you're going
so
at.
we are on the list to receive the money because we're accredited and we should be able to receive that money when those children come for next school year, but you know, I don't know what that looks like.
Okay.
So you raise an important point that I do not have the answer to, but what it does, and I'm so happy. First of all, shout out to what you and your colleagues have managed to stand up with your $2, your expertise, and your vision. It's important that you bring this up because I have to point out a sober reality that I think we all know, but is worth stating aloud. We do not have the infrastructure right now to support our children, even if we wanted to. So the step that you all have taken, and tell me the name of your organization again.
The collective is called Black Micro Schools ATL. Black Micro Schools.
Black Micro Schools ATL is right now a collective. We need that to be a movement. We need to proliferate these models, these proofs of concept, and not every, instantiation is going to look, it's not going to be a franchise where every instantiation looks exactly like the blueprint that you all have come up with, but we need to be planting these seeds that are going to grow into trees. There's actually a motif of a tree growing up. This young man's shirt, that's Mary Smith Peak's oak tree. That represents our freedom dreams, but the idea that you got to plant that thing, and sometimes that's going to take time. We as a people, and I'm talking to Black folks in this audience right now, we do not have the infrastructure right now in place to fully support our communities if we even wanted to, from a take it off the table standpoint. But that's okay. That for us lets us know that we really do need to be pouring resources into organizations like this, thinking a lot about what would it take to build out these models, and then how to hold our local government accountable to support these types of efforts as they grow throughout the Atlanta metro area, because it's these suite of options are necessary and going to be even more necessary as we have the Department of Education pulling back resources en masse from our system. So that means not just folks who are starting the organizations like yourself. Some of us, we need to just be pulling our checkbooks out and donating to your organization. Some of us are retired teachers or current teachers like me and Nicole. We need to be volunteering a Saturday to organizations like this. This is how that $2 school becomes Bethune-Cookman College. If the cavalry's not coming, again, the message is it's us. And that's a good thing because we got a lot of good stuff to bring to the table. But we got to move those hopes into vision and put it into action.
I know we're supposed to wrap up, but I forgot to ask you like one of the most important questions. And you alluded to the artwork on the cover. Okay. Can you explain the cover for those who do not recognize this face?
Oh. What is the significance of Georgetown?
Yes.
Okay, so this cover is a piece of artwork produced by Atlanta Black fine artist Charlie Palmer. Charlie is my husband. But that's not the reason why I love to highlight the importance and symbology of this book cover. By show of hands, do we know who George Stinney Jr. is? By show of hands? Okay. George Stinney Jr. is the youngest person in the United States to be executed by the state. So at 14 years old in the 1940s, George Stinney Jr. was tried of a crime that he did not commit, of raping 2 white girls at 14 years old. He was given a very speedy trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death. His little body was too small to fit into the electric chair, so they sat him on top of a stack of phone books so that he could sit high enough for the state to cook him. And they made his parents come and watch. So my husband paints George Stinney Jr. every year just so he will never forget this little boy. So if you see the stars on the cover, that's reminding you of the United States. This is a part of a series, The Divided States of America, and it's making a critique on our young people who have been failed by the system, okay? So that's the meaning of the painting, but what we wanted to do with this book cover is to reframe this image of George Stinney, and I wanted everybody to remember him as a boy who laughed, who had a family, who was loved, who also had freedom dreams that were taken away too soon. So every time that you touch this book, that is in your home, that you get to talk about it, there is a spiritual endowment just laid in the imagery of the book, because we are collectively always going to remember George. Thank you for giving me that opportunity to talk about him.